A monastery's high walls were built to stop armies, not just to mark a garden. This is the hidden truth of the medieval world, where quiet centers of faith became frontline fortresses. By the end of our story, you will understand a complete paradox of history, how communities devoted to peace became masters of war. We will explore why these sacred sites were targeted, how their architecture was secretly designed for battle, and who the people were that stood guard. How does a place of prayer transform into a castle, and what does it do to the soul of someone sworn to peace when they must lift a weapon? This is the story of fortified monasteries. What does true sanctuary require when the world outside turns violent? The peace of a monastery was a fragile thing, built on promises the world outside did not always keep. To see the moment that fragile peace shattered, look to the year 845. A fleet of 120 Viking longships sailed up the Seine River, their destination not a military garrison but the undefended abbey of St. Denis, just north of Paris. The monks, whose lives were dedicated to copying sacred texts and tending their lands, had no answer for the sudden violence at their gates. The raiders did not come for conquest, but for the abbey's legendary treasury of gold, silver, and jeweled relics. They left with a fortune, proving a terrible new truth. In a fractured world, a community's holiness could not shield its wealth. This was the new reality after Rome's fall. The great roads grew quiet, the legions were a memory, and centralized power had dissolved into a patchwork of local lords often unable to protect lands beyond their own castles. Into this power vacuum came waves of movement and conflict. From the north, Viking raiders used Europe's rivers as highways to strike deep inland at the soft, rich heart of communities. From the east, mounted warriors like the Magyars swept across the plains in lightning-fast raids. There was no front line because every quiet valley, every river bend could become one. And what was the richest, most visible landmark in any valley? It was very often the monastery. Over generations, through the donations of pious nobles and the diligent work of its members, a monastic house amassed not just spiritual capital, but very real, tangible wealth. It controlled vast farmlands, its altars gleamed with gold and gemstones offered to the saints, and its scriptorium housed books of unimaginable value, each one representing years of labor by master craftsmen. To a raiding party, this was not a holy site. It was a bank vault with its doors left unlocked. The ancient Christian idea of sanctuary, the inviolable safety offered within church walls, was being brutally tested. Spiritual protection required a physical guarantee that no longer existed. An abbot watching the smoke rise from a neighboring village knew his community was next. He faced an impossible dilemma. His vows called for a rejection of violence, a commitment to peace, but his duty as a shepherd was to protect his flock, the sacred relics entrusted to him, and the accumulated knowledge of centuries held in his library. To do nothing was to invite destruction. This was the critical choice, the pivot point in history, adapt or perish. So the adaptation began. It started not with grand battlements but with pragmatic, fearful increments. The outer wall of the cloister, once a simple marker of sacred space, was made thicker, higher. Wooden gates were replaced with iron-reinforced oak. Watchtowers were added, not for their view of the heavens, but for their view of the approaching road. The peaceful cloister was learning the language of the landscape. It began to position itself on defensible ground, near cliffs or rivers that could shield one side. The church itself, the heart of the community, was often built with sturdy, fortress-like walls, its bell tower doubling as a lookout post. This was the genesis. The purely spiritual haven was evolving, molecule by molecule, into a defensible compound. The sacred and the strategic were entering into a reluctant but necessary alliance, all for one simple, desperate goal: preservation. The question was no longer if they would be attacked, but when. And when that moment came, who would be left inside to meet the threat? This slow, fearful evolution of walls and watchtowers was more than just construction. It was a profound architectural alchemy. The builders faced a unique challenge: to fortify a sacred space without destroying its soul. They couldn't simply build a brutish castle, because every stone still had to serve a higher purpose. The solution was a brilliant, subtle fusion, where every defensive feature wore the face of faith. Take the classic monastic layout, centered on a square garden courtyard called the cloister garth. This was meant to symbolize the enclosed paradise of Eden, a peaceful, inward-focused heart. Fortification meant turning this entire complex outward, transforming that symbolic enclosure into a literal one. The simple low wall around the garden became a thick, high-perimeter curtain, often backed by an earthen bank to absorb the impact of siege engines. The paradise within was now shielded by a rampart. Natural geography became a co-conspirator in this design. A monastery might be nestled against a sheer cliff face, using the rock as an impassable rear wall. A looping river could protect two flanks, leaving only one approach to defend. This wasn't just practical, it was poetic, using God's own creation as the first line of defense. Then there was the bell tower or campanile. Its primary function was to call the community to prayer, its sound carrying across the fields. But height is a universal military advantage. So these towers were subtly reinforced, their upper levels designed with wider window openings that offered sweeping, 360-degree views of the approaching landscape. The monk ringing the Angelus bell at dusk was also the community's best early warning system. The most dramatic transformation, however, happened at the main entrance. The gatehouse of a monastery was traditionally a symbol of hospitality, a welcoming portal for pilgrims and the poor. Under threat, that symbolism inverted. The welcoming portal became the community's most fortified choke point. A single, narrow entrance replaced wide gates. A heavy iron portcullis, a grid of spikes that could be dropped in an instant, was installed just inside the outer doors. Above the passage, hidden in the ceiling, were murder holes, openings through which defenders could drop stones or pour unpleasant substances down on anyone who breached the outer door. The path to spiritual sanctuary became a deadly funnel, designed to trap and neutralize. This was the genius of the fortified monastery. From a distance, it still looked like what it was, a community of faith, its church spire reaching for the heavens. But up close, every element revealed a dual purpose. The buttresses that supported the high vaults of the chapel also strengthened the walls against battering rams. The deep-set, narrow windows that cast holy light onto the altar were also terrible vantage points for archers. This architectural alchemy created a hybrid that defied simple categories. It was a house of God that could also function as a castle of man, a spiritual fortress where the geometry of prayer and the geometry of war had become, out of sheer necessity, one and the same. But stone alone cannot hold a line. Walls need defenders, and this presented the next, even more profound dilemma: who would stand on those ramparts when the attack came? The stone walls were now ready, but stone does not fight. It merely waits. Who, then, would stand upon those ramparts when the enemy finally appeared at the gate? The answer reveals a second, more human principle of the monastic fortress: its garrison. This was not a uniform army, but a community with a built-in defense force, a social structure where spiritual and secular duties were woven together for survival. At the heart of this community were the choir monks, men who had renounced the world to dedicate their lives to prayer, study, and the sacred offices. Their primary weapon was the psalter, not the spear, yet their presence was the entire reason for the defense, the spiritual core the walls existed to protect. The physical labor of sustaining that core fell to another group entirely: the lay brothers. these men, often from local knightly or farming families, took simpler religious vows. They managed the vast estates, worked the fields, tended the animals, and handled all the practical tasks that kept the community fed and functioning. Crucially, many of them brought worldly skills into the cloister, including knowledge of arms and combat. When raiders came, the same hands that plowed the fields or repaired a cart could, out of necessity, pick up a bow or a spear to man the walls. This created a ready, if part-time, militia drawn from within the community itself, but the defense did not stop there. A major abbey was like a small town, and it often employed a small permanent guard of men-at-arms, professional fighters whose job was to patrol the perimeter and guard the gates. Furthermore, the monastery's authority extended over the surrounding villages whose tenant farmers worked its lands. In exchange for protection and the right to farm, these loyal tenants could be called upon in an emergency to bolster the defenses. So picture the scene when the watchtower bell clanged in alarm. The choir monks would gather the most precious relics and manuscripts, securing them in the church's strongest crypt or tower. The abbot, perhaps a former nobleman himself, would coordinate the response. Lay brothers and tenant farmers, directed by the hired men-at-arms, would take up positions at the murder holes, the wall walks, and the gatehouse. The community transformed in that moment, each person fulfilling a role in a practiced drill of preservation. This blending of the sacred and the martial reached its most explicit form in the military orders, like the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitaller. These were not simply warriors who prayed, they were monks who fought. They took the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but their obedience included a mandate to wield the sword in defense of pilgrims and holy places. For them, the fortified monastery was not a compromise. It was the perfect expression of their dual identity, a cloister built for battle from its very foundation. In the everyday life of a standard abbey, however, this duality was more subtle, a quiet undercurrent. A lay brother might spend his morning in prayer in the chapel, his afternoon training with a quarterstaff in the courtyard, and his evening standing watch from the bell tower. The line between spiritual devotion and secular duty was not so much blurred as it was braided together, each strand essential to the other. The community's survival depended on this intricate social contract. But this necessary arrangement created a deep and persistent tension within the Christian world, a philosophical conflict that could not be resolved by walls alone. This necessary braiding of prayer and protection created something far greater than a simple refuge. It created a strategic sanctum, a fortress whose power was amplified by its deliberate placement on the map. The founders of these communities understood that true security was not just about strong walls, but about controlling the very landscape. Many of the greatest monasteries were not built in remote wilderness to escape the world, but were planted directly upon its vital arteries. They rose at the narrow necks of river valleys where trade routes bottlenecked. They anchored mountain passes where travelers moved from one kingdom to another. They stood sentinel over the crumbling remnants of old Roman roads, the superhighways of a bygone empire that were still the main channels for people, goods, and armies. This positioning was a masterstroke of foresight. A fortified abbey on a high bluff overlooking a river crossing did not just offer its monks a beautiful view. It gave them control. From that vantage, the community could see everything moving for miles. A merchant caravan, a pilgrim group, or a warband could not pass unseen. This transformed the monastery from a passive recipient of alms into an active player in regional affairs. It could, quite literally, open or close the gate. For friendly travelers and traders, the abbey offered a safe haven, a place to rest, repair wagons, and find protection for the night, often for a modest fee or toll. This was not extortion, but a practical exchange, security for sustenance, that funded the monastery's works. For a hostile force, however, that same gate remained shut, and the fortified walls turned the vital route into a dead end. The strategic value was immense. A local lord or king, recognizing this, would often become the monastery's greatest patron, donating land and wealth not purely out of piety, but out of shrewd political calculation. By supporting a loyal abbey in a key location, the ruler effectively gained a permanent, self-sustaining garrison that guarded his frontier at no ongoing cost to his own treasury. The monks and their lay brethren became keepers of the kingdom's gate. A perfect example of this is the great abbey of St. Maurice in the Alpine passes of what is now Switzerland. Founded in a steep valley that served as a major north-south corridor through the mountains, it commanded the route. For centuries, it functioned as a spiritual center, a military bulwark against invaders from the south, and a customs house. Its power derived as much from geography as from faith. This calculated placement elevated the monastery's purpose. It was no longer just a remote spiritual center hoping to be left alone. It had become a key node in the region's defensive and economic network, a linchpin. Its protection was now a matter of urgent secular importance, as vital to the king's security as any castle. The community's survival was intertwined with the stability of the entire realm. This fusion of sacred duty and secular strategy reached its peak in one of history's most dramatic and isolated experiments, where an entire rocky island was transformed into a monument to divine defense. The transformation of a spiritual retreat into a strategic stronghold came with an almost unimaginable price tag. High stone walls, iron-reinforced gates, and towering watchtowers were not built with prayers alone, they were built with treasure. The fourth, and perhaps most practical, pillar of the monastic fortress was its economy, a complex financial engine that had to fuel perpetual defense. This was the economics of salvation, measured in cartloads of stone and the wages of master masons. Consider the sheer scale. Constructing even a simple curtain wall around a large abbey required quarrying thousands of tons of stone, transporting it, and paying skilled laborers for years of work. Maintaining that wall, repairing damage from weather or siege, and paying a permanent guard were ongoing costs that never ceased. So where did the money come from? The answer lies in a three-part financial foundation that turned these communities into some of the most sophisticated economic entities of the Middle Ages. The first source was patronage. A wealthy duke or count seeking to secure his border or ensure prayers for his soul would grant vast tracts of land to an abbey. This was not a simple gift, it was an investment. The noble gained a loyal, fortified ally on a troublesome frontier and the spiritual credit of supporting God's work. The monastery gained the raw material for wealth, farmland, and forests that would generate income for generations. This leads to the second source, direct production. Monasteries became expert managers of the agrarian economy. Their estates, worked by lay brothers and tenant farmers, produced enormous surpluses of grain, wool, and wine. They built mills on rivers to grind flour, not just for their own bread, but as a service to surrounding villages, collecting a portion of the grain as payment. They cultivated vineyards and brewed ale, selling the excess. This disciplined, centralized management gave them a steady, reliable cash flow that could be directed toward the mason's yard instead of the market. But the most fascinating revenue stream was specifically spiritual, the business of relics. If an abbey possessed a revered object, say a bone fragment of a major saint or a piece of the true cross, it became a magnet. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to venerate it, seeking healing, blessing, or forgiveness. And where pilgrims traveled, an economy followed. These visitors needed food, shelter, and souvenirs. They made offerings at the shrine, donations that were often explicitly earmarked for building projects. A chronicler from the Abbey of Conques in France records how the flow of pilgrims coming to see the relics of Saint Foy provided the funds to rebuild their church and fortify its towers. The holiest object in the treasury literally paid for the walls that kept it safe. This combination of patronage, agriculture, and pilgrimage created a powerful economic engine. The monastery evolved into a major feudal lord, collecting rents, administering justice, and managing a sprawling enterprise. Its abbot had to think like a CEO and a general, balancing ledgers to pay for soldiers and stone. The community's spiritual mission and its physical survival became two sides of the same coin. Every prayer offered at the altar was underwritten by the sweat of the fields and the offerings of the faithful, all converted into the enduring language of fortified walls. This financial might allowed them to not just exist, but to project stability across an unstable landscape. Yet this very success, this blending of sacred power and earthly wealth, would eventually attract a different kind of scrutiny, one not from raiders at the gate, but from critics within the faith itself. The immense cost of those walls was about far more than physical security. Every stone laid was also a statement, a theological idea made visible in the landscape. This symbolism of the rampart is our fifth and most subtle point, for the walls were not just barriers, they were profound symbols that shaped how everyone, inside and out, understood the monastery's place in the world. On a spiritual level, the builders and the monks who lived within saw a direct parallel between their stone defenses and the spiritual defenses of their faith. Scripture itself spoke of God as a fortress and a stronghold. The Psalms declared, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress." So, when they raised a mighty curtain wall, they were making that metaphor literal. The physical barrier against raiders became a visible reminder of the spiritual barrier against sin, temptation, and heresy. To pass through the gate was not just to enter a protected space, but to cross a threshold into a zone of heightened holiness, a spiritual stronghold where the chaos of the world was meant to be left behind. For the common people living in the shadow of those walls, the message was equally powerful but more earthly. In an age of constant uncertainty, where local lords could rise and fall, a towering, impregnable abbey was a monument to permanence. Its sheer, unchanging presence, generation after generation, spoke of divine favor. How could such a place stand unless God himself willed it? The architecture declared that this community was under special protection, that its authority came from a source higher than any passing king or marauding army. This visible demonstration of power reinforced the church's temporal authority. A humble parish church could be ignored, but a vast complex of battlements and towers, housing the relics of saints and the wealth of centuries, commanded respect and sometimes fear. It was a clear, stone-carved lesson in the social order, showing that the spiritual realm possessed a very real, very formidable kind of strength. The fortified monastery thus became a dual symbol. For those inside, it was a reminder of their spiritual calling, a wall against the world's corruption. For those outside, it was a demonstration of unshakable institutional power, a wall that defined the boundary between the sacred and the profane. This duality made it an unshakable pillar of medieval life, a fixed point in a shifting world. Its strength was both its promise and its warning, a testament to a faith that had learned, for its own survival, to build in the language of both the divine and the defender. This remarkable fusion of meanings, however, would face its ultimate test not from a foreign army, but from a force that emerged from within Christendom itself, a new way of thinking that would question the very need for such walls. The ultimate expression of this sacred fortress idea did not rise from a fertile valley, but from the sea itself. Off the coast of Normandy, a solitary granite rock emerges from a vast tidal flat, crowned by a spire that seems to pierce the sky. This is the Abbey of Mont-Saint-Michel, a case study in how every principle of the monastic fortress could be perfected by nature and human will working in concert. Its primary defense was not built by monks but by the ocean. Twice each day, the world's highest tides surge in with astonishing speed, transforming the surrounding bay into a swirling, impassable moat. For hours, the mount is an island, utterly isolated. any attacking army would see its approach route vanish beneath the waves, stranding it on shifting sands or drowning it entirely. The abbey's founders chose this site not for convenience, but for its terrifying, God-given impermeability. Upon this natural fortress, successive generations of abbots built a masterpiece of layered defense. They constructed not one wall, but multiple concentric rings of ramparts and bastions that spiral up the rock, each level commanding the one below. The single village gate at the base is a formidable choke point, leading to a steep, winding path known as the Grand Rue, easily barricaded and raked with fire from above. The approach is a gauntlet designed to break the momentum of any assault long before it reached the sacred abbey at the summit. This architectural genius was tested in fire during the long conflict known as the 100 Years' War. English forces controlling much of Normandy laid siege to Mont-Saint-Michel repeatedly, determined to capture this symbolic stronghold. They failed every time. The defenders were a testament to the community garrison model, a mix of Benedictine monks, a permanent royal garrison paid by the King of France, and loyal local militiamen. They had one critical advantage: the sea. Even when the English blockaded the mount by land, small French boats, knowing the treacherous tidal channels, could slip past under cover of fog or darkness, bringing supplies and reinforcements. The abbey was sustained by faith, by loyalty, and by the rhythm of the tides. Its successful defense transformed the mount from a regional pilgrimage site into a national symbol. To the French kingdom, its unwavering resistance amidst widespread English conquest became a powerful legend, a sign of divine favor for their cause. The survival was attributed to the Archangel Michael himself, the abbey's patron, believed to be guarding his rocky citadel. But the real miracle was one of pragmatic adaptation, the seamless fusion of an unassailable natural site, relentless military engineering, and a community whose entire existence was organized around holding that line. Mont-Saint-Michel stands as the complete argument in stone, proving that when faith, geography, and strategy align, a sanctuary can become not just a refuge but a legend. Yet this model of isolated, self-sufficient strength would soon face a challenge that no high tide or thick wall could hold back: a revolution in thought that questioned the very soul of the fortress monastery. Yet within those towering walls of Mont-Saint-Michel and every fortified cloister like it, a quieter, more profound battle was always being waged. It was a conflict of conscience, fought not on the ramparts but in the hearts of the defenders. Here lies the central paradox of the entire story: the ethical and psychological tension faced by those sworn to peace who found themselves preparing for war. How does a person reconcile the command to turn the other cheek with the duty to lift a sword in defense of their home and their brothers? This was the impossible question echoing through every silent corridor after the watch was set. Theological justifications did evolve, carefully constructed to bridge this chasm. Scholars and abbots pointed to ancient Christian teachings on the concept of a just war, principles that allowed for the use of force under strict conditions, primarily for the defense of the innocent and the protection of sacred order. On the scale of a kingdom, this might justify an army. On the scale of a monastery, it justified the gatehouse guard. The violence was not framed as aggression, but as a last resort of protection, a shield held up to safeguard the prayers, the pilgrims, and the precious relics within. Defending the abbey was seen as defending the faith itself, a holy obligation that temporarily set aside the ideal of personal nonviolence for a greater communal good. This led to intricate practical compromises within the community's daily life. The choir monks, bound by the strictest interpretation of their vows, would often retreat to the church during an assault, their role to pray fervently for deliverance and for the souls of all involved, friend and foe alike. Their warfare was spiritual. The physical defense was delegated to those whose vows were different, the lay brothers and the hired men at arms. This created a kind of sacred division of labor, a way for the community to participate in its own defense while maintaining a spiritual hierarchy. A lay brother could wield a crossbow in the afternoon and kneel for vespers in the evening, his actions seen not as a betrayal of faith, but as a different form of service to it. This complex mindset reveals a medieval world that did not see clear lines between the sacred and the secular in the way we might today. The defense of the faith was a holistic endeavor. Protecting the physical vessel, the monastery that housed the divine presence, was a sacred act. The tension was not ignored, but it was navigated as a necessary hardship, a burden borne for the sake of preservation. It forced every member of the community to live in a state of moral ambiguity, where the ideal of perfect peace existed alongside the grim reality of the spear and the shield. They built their walls not out of a desire for conflict, but from a heartbreaking understanding that their peace was a treasure that required guarding, sometimes by means that stained the hands of the guards. This difficult balance between the heavenly ideal and the earthly reality defined their existence, a testament to the lengths a community will go to preserve its light in a world that often dwells in shadow. A siege at a monastery's gates was a conflict unlike any other. For the attackers, it presented an immediate and uncomfortable dilemma. To assault a castle was a straightforward act of war, but to breach the walls of a recognized holy place risked something far greater than military failure. It invited the wrath of heaven and the condemnation of the wider Christian world. An army that desecrated a major abbey could find itself branded as sacrilegious, turning public opinion and even their own lord's support against them. Defenders understood this fear intimately and used it as a psychological weapon. From the ramparts, they might display sacred relics on the battlements, a silent reminder that every arrow loosed against the wall was an offense against the saints themselves. The siege became a battle for moral high ground as much as for physical ground. Inside, the monastery's very design, perfected for a life of self-sufficiency, became its greatest military asset. The large storehouses and granaries, built to feed the community and provide charity through lean winters, now stocked provisions for a protracted blockade. The deep, stone-lined wells within the cloister, essential for daily ritual and sanitation, guaranteed a supply of fresh water long after a besieging army might have to drink from muddy streams. The expansive church, with its thick walls and high, sloping roofs, offered more than just a place for prayer. Its rooftops became elevated platforms for lookouts and archers, giving them a commanding field of fire over the outer walls and the approaches below. Every architectural feature born of peaceful routine was repurposed for endurance. This transformed a military siege into a profound test of spiritual resolve. While attackers camped in the mud, growing restless and low on supplies, the defenders were sustained by more than just grain and water. Their daily rhythm of prayer and ritual continued within the fortified heart. The sound of the bells calling the hours, the chanting from the chapel, these were not signs of desperation but of defiant normalcy. They served as a constant reminder to both sides that time inside these walls moved to a different, more enduring rhythm. The community's unity and faith became a tangible resource, as crucial to their morale as their stockpiles of arrows. A doubting, fractious garrison might surrender a castle when hunger set in, but a community bound by a shared sacred purpose could endure hardships that would break a secular force. The outcome often hinged on which side faltered first in spirit, the attackers under the weight of sacrilege and stalemate, or the defenders under the strain of isolation and fear. In these standoffs, the true strength of the monastic fortress was revealed, not merely in the thickness of its walls, but in the unwavering resilience of the life it was built to protect. But the strength of stone and spirit inside those walls was only half of the story. No monastery, no matter how self-sufficient, was truly an island. Its survival was woven into a complex web of external alliances, a ninth and critical layer of its defense that extended its influence far beyond its own battlements. This network connected the sacred cloister directly to the halls of secular power, turning it from a solitary fortress into a key piece on the regional political chessboard. The most important of these bonds was often a formal pact of protection, known in the Latin documents as a mundiburdium. This was a solemn agreement where a king, an emperor, or a powerful local duke pledged his sword and his authority to defend a specific monastery from all harm. In a world of fragmented loyalties, this royal seal on a charter was a powerful deterrent, a signal to any potential raider that attacking this abbey meant making an enemy of the realm's strongest warrior. But this protection was never a one-way gift. It was a transaction, a feudal exchange with spiritual currency. In return for the lord's military shield, the monastery offered something he could not get anywhere else, a direct line to the divine. The monks pledged to pray specifically for the protector's soul and the success of his reign, providing a kind of eternal spiritual insurance policy. Their very existence as a beacon of holiness under his care granted him political legitimacy, showing his subjects and rivals that he ruled with God's favor. Sometimes the support was even more tangible, with the monastery's considerable wealth providing loans or gifts to fund the Lord's own military campaigns. These alliances were carefully recorded on parchment, formalized through charters and sacred oaths that made the relationship binding. A king might be named the official advocate or defender of the abbey in its founding document. This created a mutual defense pact that benefited both sides enormously. For the monastery, it meant that an attack on their gates was now an attack on the crown itself, likely summoning a royal army to their aid. For the secular ruler, it meant gaining a loyal, fortified outpost that guarded a strategic crossroads or river valley at no ongoing cost to his treasury, all while earning spiritual merit. This intricate network reveals a profound truth. A monastery's military strength was not contained solely within its walls. Its real power was amplified by its connections, by the invisible threads of obligation and loyalty that stretched to the local castle, the regional court, and even the royal palace. The abbot was not just a spiritual leader, he was a diplomat and a political player maintaining these vital relationships. The fortified monastery, therefore, stood at the intersection of faith and feudal obligation. It was a spiritual powerhouse that also functioned as a diplomatic node and a strategic asset. Its security guaranteed as much by the words on a royal charter as by the stone of its ramparts. This integration into the very fabric of secular power ensured its endurance, but it also meant the monastery's fate was forever tied to the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. Behind the iron gates and stone ramparts, the monastery's true arsenal was not stored in an armory, but in a quiet, lamplit room. This was the library, a fortress of knowledge whose contents were as vital to survival as any stockpile of spears. While the walls defended the body of the community, the library defended its mind, its history, and its legal soul. Within its locked chests and on its wooden shelves lay a different kind of weaponry, one that gave the monks a strategic advantage no invading army could easily storm. The most direct of these intellectual arms were the classical texts themselves, preserved through centuries of diligent copying. Among the psalters and theological commentaries, a careful search would reveal practical manuals from the ancient world. A monk might unroll a copy of Vegetius's on military matters, a Roman treatise that detailed everything from the ideal construction of a camp to the discipline of a legion. Another might study the architectural principles of Vitruvius, learning about load-bearing walls, the strength of arches, and the sourcing of durable stone. During long periods of peace, these were not mere curiosities. They were textbooks. An abbot planning to reinforce his abbey's outer wall could consult these ancient experts, applying Roman engineering solutions to a medieval problem. The quiet scholar in the scriptorium, his hands stained with ink, was indirectly drafting the blueprints for the next bastion. His knowledge translated directly into stronger defenses, proving that the pen, in a very literal sense, could design the sword. Yet the library's defensive role went far beyond military engineering. Its most guarded documents were often not books at all, but charters. These were ornate, sealed parchments that recorded every gift of land, every privilege, and every royal protection granted to the monastery since its founding. In a world where memory was fragile and power was contested, these charters were the community's legal title to existence. If a local lord grew ambitious and claimed the abbey's fertile fields as his own, the monks could retreat to their library, retrieve the precise charter from 200 years prior, and present it as evidence. This was a battle fought not on a battlefield, but in a court or before a bishop's council. The ability to produce an original, sealed document, often written in imposing formal Latin and invoking the authority of long-dead kings and popes, was a devastatingly powerful move. It turned vague tradition into incontestable fact. The library, therefore, was the guardian of the community's legal identity. It held the proof of their right to be there, to own what they owned, and to enjoy the protections they claimed. A rival could besiege the walls, but he could not besiege the truth contained in those carefully preserved parchments. In this way, the scriptorium and the library performed a dual service. By day, scribes copied sacred texts to save souls. By the same hand, they also copied and preserved the charters that saved the community's lands. Every stroke of the quill was an act of preservation, defending against both spiritual oblivion and earthly theft. The library was thus the ultimate expression of the monastery's enduring power. It fortified the past to secure the future, making knowledge itself the most resilient wall of all. This intellectual capital ensured that even if an enemy one day breached the physical gate, the institution's claim to the land and its legacy would remain, waiting in the archives for a more peaceful time to be reasserted. The bell that called the monks to prayer could, in an instant, become a weapon of sound. This was the reality of daily life inside a fortified sanctuary, where the sacred schedule and the demands of defense were not two separate worlds, but a single, integrated rhythm. The monastic day was structured around the divine office, a cycle of 8 prayer services known as the horarium, beginning with matins in the deep night and ending with compline at dusk. This rhythm of devotion now provided the steady heartbeat for a community that was also perpetually on watch. The same bell that rang for lords at dawn might later clang in a rapid, urgent pattern, signaling every able-bodied person to their pre-assigned posts. The transition was not chaotic but a practiced drill, a shift from one form of service to another. After the morning prayers of prime, a lay brother would not simply return to the scriptorium or the garden. He might first report to the armory, a secured room near the gatehouse, to inspect his assigned gear, perhaps a helmet and a crossbow kept in good repair. His afternoon, spent pruning vines in the monastery's expansive vineyard, was a form of training in itself, building the endurance and familiarity with the landscape that would be vital if he needed to hold a section of wall for hours. Archery practice was not a sport but a solemn duty, often conducted in the inner courtyard where straw targets were set against a safe earthen bank. The twang of the bowstring and the thud of arrows striking home became sounds as ordinary as the chant from the chapel, both understood as essential to the community's preservation. This constant state of tempered alertness required a discipline that mirrored and even amplified the monastic rule. The Benedictine motto was ora et labora, pray and work. In a fortified house, this quietly expanded to pray, work, and watch. The strict obedience demanded by the abbot in spiritual matters applied equally to the defense roster. The self-denial practiced in the refectory, taking only what was needed, found its echo in the careful conservation of arrows, oil, and food stores. The vigilance over one's own thoughts, a core spiritual exercise, was mirrored by the physical vigilance from the watchtower. The two disciplines, spiritual and martial, reinforced each other, creating a culture of profound readiness that permeated every hour. This fusion reshaped the very space of the cloister. The covered walkway surrounding the garden, meant for quiet meditation, might also be where men-at-arms polished their mail after a night watch. The cellar that stored wine for the sacrament also held barrels of grain for a siege. There was no clean division between the sacred and the strategic, only a seamless, purposeful integration. The community lived in a state of graceful preparedness, where the act of drawing water from the well was both a daily chore and a check on a critical siege resource. This life demanded a unique kind of resilience, a mind capable of holding both the peaceful cadence of a psalm and the tactical layout of the outer wall in simultaneous focus. It forged individuals and an entire community that understood protection not as an occasional emergency, but as a permanent condition of their peace, a paradox lived out in every sunrise and every set of the watch. The discipline of the fortified cloister found its most breathtaking expression not in a valley or on a tidal island, but high in the air. In the heart of Greece, colossal pillars of stone rise from the plain of Thessaly, their summits lost in the clouds. Upon these impossible perches, monks built the monasteries of Meteora, a case study in how isolation itself could become the ultimate fortress. Their defense was not a wall you could touch, but a distance you could not cross. During the long, difficult decline of the Byzantine Empire, as political and military pressure increased from many sides, these natural stone towers offered something unique, not a place to make a military stand, but a place to simply disappear from the world's conflicts altogether. The primary architectural feature of these sanctuaries was the terrifying void beneath them. Access was a calculated ordeal. Initially, the only way up was via a series of rope ladders that could be drawn up at a moment's notice, or by being hauled in a net suspended from a long, creaking winch dangling hundreds of feet above the ground. The approach was a test of faith and nerve, designed to deter all but the most determined pilgrims or the most desperate of refugees. This was fortification through absolute verticality. There were no murder holes or portcullises because the cliff face itself performed that function. An attacking force would arrive at the base of these smooth rock monoliths and find no gate to batter, no wall to scale, only sheer, unclimbable stone. The very geography that made life arduous for the monks, requiring them to haul every stone, every sack of grain, every drop of water skyward, was the same geography that made conquest nearly impossible. Their strategy was one of sublime passivity. They did not prepare to repel armies, they removed themselves from the army's reach entirely. This made Meteora a perfect refuge for something beyond people, for the fragile treasures of a fading empire. As Byzantine territories faced periods of hardship and transition, these sky-bound monasteries became arks. They safeguarded not only monks seeking a life of prayer removed from turmoil, but also priceless religious icons, ancient manuscripts, and sacred artifacts transported from lowland churches and monasteries under threat. The cultural and spiritual continuity of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, in many ways, was lifted up and preserved on those rocks. The silence of the summit was a different kind of strength. While a Western European abbey like Mont-Saint-Michel projected power through its strategic placement and military readiness, Meteora embodied a powerful retreat. It demonstrated that preservation could be achieved not through confrontation, but through sublime, unassailable remoteness. The rock was both hermitage and stronghold, a sanctuary where the primary defensive tactic was to be so far above the fray that the fray could not touch you. This choice represented a profound philosophical alternative in the story of monastic fortification, where security was found not in the thickness of a wall, but in the thinness of the air. The sky-bound retreat of Meteora represented one path, but the medieval world also forged its opposite. In the same era, a new kind of institution emerged, one that did not hide from violence but was purpose-built to manage it. These were the military orders, the most formal and powerful fusion of the monastic ideal and the warrior's craft. While not traditional monasteries in the pure sense, orders like the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights took the reluctant compromise we have seen and made it their entire reason for being. They were, in essence, monk soldiers. Their members took the classic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, living under a strict religious rule. Yet their primary mission was explicitly martial, to protect pilgrims traveling to holy sites or to conduct what were seen as holy wars. This was not a community that sometimes had to defend itself. It was a community whose very purpose was defense and often offense. Their headquarters and outposts, known as commanderies, were the ultimate expression of the fortified religious house. Scattered across Europe and the Holy Land, these were not isolated sanctuaries but nodes in a vast, disciplined international network. A commandery in rural England or France was more than a local fortress. It was a supply depot, a recruiting center, and a bank funneling men, money, and material to the front lines of conflict thousands of miles away. Their design left no room for ambiguity. These were castles first, with chapels built inside them. The church was integrated into the defensive circuit, its apse sometimes forming a formidable rounded tower. The living quarters were barracks, the storerooms were arsenals, and the entire complex operated with the efficiency of a multinational corporation dedicated to sacred warfare. The Templars, perhaps the most famous, perfected this model. Beginning as a small band tasked with protecting pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem, they evolved into a transnational powerhouse. Their commanderies were economic engines, managing vast estates that funded their operations. A traveler could deposit funds at a Templar house in Paris and withdraw the equivalent in silver in Jerusalem, using a coded letter of credit, a system that made them pioneers of international finance. This network gave them a reach and resilience no single kingdom could match. They became the medieval world's first standing professional army, answerable primarily to the Pope, moving seamlessly across borders. These orders represent the logical, if extreme, endpoint of the trend we have been tracing. They show how the medieval church, facing the chaotic violence of the era, learned not just to tolerate martial energy, but to institutionalize it, to channel it into religiously sanctioned organizations with global reach. The individual knight's internal conflict between piety and violence was resolved by his order's rule, which framed his sword arm as an instrument of divine will. The fortified monastery was no longer a place of peace that had to be defended. It was the forward operating base for a sacred campaign. Their legacy is profoundly mixed, marked by both legendary piety and brutal conquest, but their historical impact is undeniable. They crystallized an idea that faith could wear armor, and that the most formidable walls were those built around a shared, militant purpose. Yet even these mighty international orders could not withstand the shifting tides of politics and power, raising a final question: what happens to a fortress, spiritual or physical, when the world it was built for simply changes? But the stone that shielded the spirit could also begin to crush it. For every abbey that thrived as a strategic sanctum, there was a hidden ledger of spiritual costs, a slow erosion that came from living in a state of perpetual defense. The immense resources required to maintain walls and garrisons created a constant financial drain. Funds that once flowed freely into the scriptorium for new books, into the almoner's purse for the poor at the gate, or into commissioning a master artisan to carve a new altar screen, were now redirected. The mason's wage, the blacksmith's iron, and the soldier's stipend took priority. The community's charitable reach, a core tenet of its faith, often shrank first. The bread distributed to the hungry might become less plentiful. The hospice for the ill might see its resources stretched thin. A monastery's greatness was once measured by its generosity, but its survival could come to depend on its frugality and its focus inward on its own preservation. This inward turn was not merely financial. The very presence of armed men within the cloister, even loyal lay brothers or hired guards, introduced a different energy into a space designed for contemplation. The clash of steel in the courtyard during practice, the rough talk of the watch, the constant awareness of threat, these elements could subtly poison the atmosphere of peace. Tensions might arise between the choir monks, who saw the defense as a necessary evil, and the lay brethren or soldiers, who saw it as their primary duty. An abbot, once a spiritual father, now had to act as a military commander, making decisions about patrols and provisions that had little to do with scripture. This division of focus could lead to internal strife, a fracturing of the community's unified purpose. In some houses, chronicles note a gradual decline in the rigor of the religious offices, a shortening of prayer times, or a neglect of the quiet scholarship that had been their pride. The spiritual core, the reason for all those walls, was being slowly starved by the very mechanisms built to protect it. The paradox deepened further when the monastery succeeded too well in its militarization. A massively fortified abbey with its own loyal militia and vast independent wealth ceased to be just a spiritual neighbor to the local duke or count. It became a rival power center. Its abbot could raise troops, levy taxes on his lands, and refuse entry to a secular lord. What was designed to deter foreign raiders could now be perceived as a direct threat to the regional balance of power. This invited a different kind of conflict, not from pagan invaders, but from Christian nobles who saw the monastery's independence as an affront to their own authority. Similarly, within the church hierarchy, a powerful, militarized abbey could grow defiant of its own bishop, arguing that its unique defensive needs placed it above ordinary ecclesiastical oversight. The fortress, built for protection, could become a beacon for envy and political ambition, drawing the very conflict it sought to keep outside its gates. This was the ultimate gamble of the fortified cloister. In seeking to preserve the institution from physical destruction, it risked corrupting the institution's soul. The walls that kept danger out could also wall the community in, isolating it from the world of charity and connection it was meant to serve. The discipline of the watch could slowly strangle the discipline of the spirit. Some communities navigated this tension with remarkable balance for centuries. Others found the burden too great, and the monastery that began as a beacon of learning and piety gradually hardened into a wealthy, paranoid, and politically entangled shell of its original ideal. The stone endured, but the light within could grow dim. This delicate balance between being a sanctuary and a stronghold would face its greatest test not from a siege, but from a revolution in technology that made all their towering walls suddenly, terrifyingly obsolete. The challenge of preserving both body and spirit demanded more than just discipline. It required ingenuity. Within the quiet scriptoriums and busy workshops of these communities, a different kind of labor was underway, one that applied the monastic tradition of learning to the urgent problems of survival. This was innovation under pressure, where the intellectual capital of the cloister became a tool for engineering resilience. Faced with the prospect of a long siege, a monastery's most vulnerable point was not always its wall, but its well. A blocked or poisoned water source could force a surrender faster than any battering ram. In response, communities invested in remarkably sophisticated hydraulic systems. They did not just dig wells, they engineered them. Some constructed intricate networks of underground pipes and channels, often lined with lead or hollowed-out wood, to bring fresh spring water from distant, protected sources directly into the heart of the cloister, sometimes even routing it through the church crypt for added security. They built massive, stone-lined cisterns to capture and store rainwater from rooftops, creating reserves that could last for months. This was not mere plumbing, it was strategic hydrology, turning a basic necessity into a guaranteed asset. The same meticulous planning applied to food. The large monastic estates produced surplus grain, and that surplus had to last. Monks became masters of preservation, employing techniques that bordered on alchemy. They constructed vast, ventilated granaries raised on stone pillars to keep rodents out and moisture low. They utilized deep, cool cellars and ice houses, packed with winter snow and insulated with straw to store meats, dairy, and medicinal herbs. Some communities even developed early forms of canning or potting, sealing food in clay jars with fat or wax. The kitchen and the cellar became extensions of the arsenal, where the battle against spoilage was a silent front in the overall war of attrition. There is also intriguing, if fragmentary, evidence that some of these centers of learning engaged with the most frightening new technology of the later Middle Ages, gunpowder. As knowledge of this substance spread from the East following the Crusades, monastic chronicles and account books occasionally hint at its presence. A ledger might list a purchase of saltpeter, a key ingredient alongside candles and incense. An archaeological find near a fortified abbey might reveal a cache of early hand cannonballs. It is unlikely that monks became full-time artillerists, but it is entirely plausible that an abbot, advised by a lay brother with worldly experience, would authorize experiments or the hiring of a master gunner to supplement the traditional defenses. They were practical institutions, and if a new tool could make their walls more formidable, they would at least seek to understand it. This spirit of adaptation extended to architecture itself. Monks who traveled to the Holy Land or who hosted returning crusaders brought back more than relics, they brought ideas. They might have seen the formidable concentric castles of the Levant, with their multiple, independently defensible rings of walls, and applied those principles on a smaller scale to their own abbey's layout. The pointed arch, so characteristic of Gothic architecture, was not just aesthetically pleasing, it was structurally superior, allowing for taller, stronger walls with larger windows for light, and not coincidentally for archers. Every architectural advancement had a potential defensive benefit, and these learned communities were keen to adopt them. This relentless problem-solving reveals a crucial truth. These were not stagnant relics clinging to an old world. They were dynamic, adaptive organisms. The same intellectual drive that led a monk to painstakingly copy an ancient text on geometry could be redirected to calculate the optimal angle for a new defensive tower. The practical knowledge of the lay brother in metallurgy or mechanics was harnessed to maintain the portcullis or design a more efficient winch. Their innovation was born from a simple, powerful imperative to protect the sacred flame within. In doing so, they became quiet contributors to the broader tapestry of medieval military engineering, proving that the need to endure can be one of history's greatest catalysts for invention. Yet within the rigid social order of the medieval world, the fortress model offered a unique form of sanctuary for a specific group of individuals, women who had taken religious vows. While the great fortified abbeys were overwhelmingly male domains, the need for security extended to communities of nuns as well, particularly those of noble birth. Their experience, our 15th perspective, reveals a different dimension of this story, where protection enabled a profound, if constrained, autonomy. The stone walls of a convent did more than keep danger out. They carved out a space of self-determination in a society that offered women few such options. A high-born woman entering a convent might be fulfilling a family's strategic alliance or a personal spiritual calling, but once inside, she entered a world she helped govern. The abbess, often from a powerful family herself, wielded remarkable authority. She managed vast estates, settled legal disputes, and oversaw a complex household. In a fortified house, that authority expanded to include the calculus of survival. While the direct bearing of arms was almost universally outside the bounds of her role, the organization of defense fell squarely within her purview. Her leadership was not on the battlements but in the storerooms, the ledger books, and the diplomatic letter. When rumors of unrest swirled, the abbess was the one who authorized the purchase of extra grain, who instructed the lay stewards to inspect the gates, and who might send a carefully worded missive to a local lord, reminding him of his sworn duty to protect the house. She coordinated the community's internal readiness, ensuring that the well was clean, the infirmary stocked, and the precious charters secured. The physical defense was executed by male agents, chaplains, hired men-at-arms, or knights provided by a protective patron, but the orchestration of the convent's response to threat relied on her administrative command and calm resolve. In this way, the fortified convent became a paradox. It existed within a patriarchal framework, reliant on men for its ultimate physical security. Yet within its walls, it was a realm largely administered and spiritually led by women. For those within, this was not a contradiction but a reality. The walls guaranteed the continuation of their religious life, free from the expectation of marriage or the direct control of a father or husband. They provided a literal and figurative space for scholarship, prayer, and community that was insulated from the volatile world outside. In times of invasion or local conflict, a well-defended convent could become a refuge not only for its nuns but for other women and children from the surrounding area, its gates a symbol of safety in a landscape of fear. The militarization of their home was indirect, but its purpose was absolute, to safeguard their chosen way of life. The stones, therefore, spoke a double language. To the outside world, they declared the convent's importance and its connections, warning against trespass. To the women inside, they whispered a promise of continuity, a guarantee that their pursuit of a spiritual calling could endure, even when the world beyond the gate descended into chaos. This fragile autonomy, protected by walls they did not personally man but decisively managed, stands as a quiet testament to the complex ways medieval women navigated power and preserved purpose. The immense stone walls, for all their strength, could not withstand the slow turning of time itself. The era of the monastic fortress did not end with a dramatic siege or a sudden collapse, but with a gradual, irreversible shift in the world outside its gates. This slow fade was driven by forces more powerful than any raiding party, forces that changed the very definition of security. The first was the slow, stubborn return of strong, centralized kingdoms. Over centuries, kings and emperors reasserted their control, building professional standing armies loyal to the crown, not to a local lord or abbot. A monarch with a well-drilled force at his command no longer needed to rely on a patchwork of independent abbeys to guard his frontiers. In fact, those same abbeys, with their own militias and wealth, began to look less like allies and more like potential rivals to royal authority. The unique deal of protection and spiritual favor that had sustained the fortified monastery for generations was becoming obsolete. The state was taking back the monopoly on violence, and the monastic militia was no longer a vital partner but an anachronism. A second, more violent wave of change arrived with the religious upheavals of the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation shattered the unified religious landscape of Western Europe. In regions where Protestant rulers took power, the very existence of monastic communities was called into question. Their wealth was seen as a corrupt remnant of a rejected faith. This led to deliberate campaigns of dissolution, where monasteries were legally disbanded by the state. Their lands were seized, their treasures confiscated, and their members dispersed. The great walls, built to withstand pagan raiders, offered no defense against a royal decree backed by law and a new theology. In England, under King Henry VIII, this process was systematic and thorough. Majestic complexes like Rivalks Abbey or Fountains Abbey, once bustling centers of faith and industry, were stripped of their lead roofs, their glass, and their valuables. What remained were the breathtaking skeletal shells we see today, romantic ruins that speak more of sudden abandonment than of a slow military decline. In other regions, especially during the devastating 30 Years' War, monasteries were caught in the crossfire between Catholic and Protestant armies, their sanctity no longer a shield in a war fought over the nature of sanctity itself. Finally, the very architecture of defense was being outpaced. The development of effective, mobile cannon in the 15th and 16th centuries changed siege warfare forever. The high, vertical stone walls that had deflected arrows and held against trebuchets were now vulnerable. A sustained artillery barrage could reduce a mighty curtain wall to rubble in a matter of days. The monastic fortress, designed for an age of scaling ladders and battering rams, was fundamentally unprepared for the age of gunpowder. Its builders had mastered the geometry of the arrow's arc, but not the parabolic trajectory of a cannonball. A community could no longer trust its survival to stone alone, no matter how thick. The strategic sanctum was becoming a strategic liability, a large, fixed target in a world where military advantage was shifting to speed, flexibility, and firepower. The result was not a sudden disappearance, but a transformation. Some monastic complexes were converted into luxurious palaces for noble families, their cloisters becoming ornamental gardens and their gatehouses grand entrances. Others were simply left to decay, their stones quarried by locals to build barns and farmhouses. The era where a religious community stood as a primary unit of defense, a self-sufficient node of spiritual and martial power, had passed. The lines between sacred and secular authority, once so creatively and necessarily blurred within those walls, were being redrawn with sharp, modern clarity. The fortress monastery faded into history, leaving behind a landscape dotted with silent, majestic ruins and repurposed buildings. They stand now not as failures, but as profound monuments to a lost world, a testament to the centuries when the peace of the soul demanded the perpetual readiness of the garrison. The true story of these fortresses is not only written in chronicles, but buried in the earth. Our 17th lens into this world comes from the quiet, meticulous science of archaeology, a field that allows us to sift through the layers of time and find tangible proof of how faith and force coexisted. At places like the great Abbey of Cluny in France or the skeletal ruins of Relics in England, the ground speaks where documents fall silent. Excavations carefully peel back centuries of renovation and decay to reveal the original footprints of these communities, and the findings are often starkly practical. Beneath the graceful arches of a later chapel, archaeologists might uncover the stout, deep foundations of a much earlier perimeter wall, its thickness designed for burden, not beauty. The outlines of a gatehouse emerge from the soil, showing the narrow, funnel-shaped entrance designed to control and constrict any rush of people. In some cases, the floor plans of buildings within the cloister, once assumed to be guest houses or workshops, reveal layouts suspiciously similar to barracks, with large, open halls suitable for housing a garrison of men-at-arms. These are not the grand designs of sacred architecture, but the blueprints of calculated defense etched permanently into the landscape. Even the smallest fragments of daily life, analyzed with modern tools, tell a compelling story. The science of archaeobotany, which studies ancient plant remains, has uncovered evidence of what are called siege gardens. Within the protected inner courtyards of some sites, soil samples reveal traces of fast-growing, nutritious plants like cabbages, beans, and root vegetables that could be cultivated quickly if the community was cut off from its external farmlands. This is the botany of contingency, a quiet, green insurance policy against starvation. Elsewhere, a closer look at the very stones of the cloister walkway or the steps to the dormitory might reveal long, shallow, parallel grooves worn into the surface. To the untrained eye, they are mere marks of age. To an archaeologist, they are the telltale scratches left by generations of lay brothers or hired guards sharpening their spear points and knife blades against the stone during idle moments. The ritual of maintaining a weapon became part of the wear and tear of the sacred space itself. Each of these material clues, from a barley seed to a whetstone groove, builds a picture far more intimate than any royal charter. They show us adaptation in action. We see how a community might retrofit a spiritual space for a secular purpose, how they planned for the worst while praying for the best. This scientific detective work corrects the romantic vision of the isolated, purely contemplative cloister. It provides irrefutable physical evidence of the military reality that was woven into the fabric of daily monastic life. The archaeology does not diminish the spiritual purpose of these places. Instead, it deepens our understanding of the immense cost and complexity of preserving that purpose in a dangerous world. The stones and seeds testify to a relentless, quiet determination, proving that the peace of the cloister was often maintained by the same hands that knew the weight of a shield. The stones of these places hold more than history, they hold stories. Long after the last watch was set and the final siege lifted, the fortified monastery found a new kind of life, not in the physical world, but in the landscape of our imagination. This is the realm of myth and memory, where the historical reality of these communities has been reshaped into powerful cultural symbols that continue to resonate. In modern storytelling, the isolated, walled abbey has become a classic setting, a stage for mysteries that echo its own paradoxical nature. Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose, perfectly captures this transformation. Its labyrinthine library, hidden within a remote 14th-century monastery, is a fortress of forbidden knowledge where the pursuit of truth becomes a deadly puzzle. The architectural reality of the defensive cloister is used to brilliant effect, its secret passages, towering walls, and restricted access creating a physical metaphor for the dangers of inquiry itself. The monastery is no longer just a backdrop, it is a character representing the tension between enlightened wisdom and dogmatic control, a tension that lived in the very stones of the real historical sites. This symbolic power extends far beyond historical fiction into the realms of fantasy and folklore. In epic tales, the secluded mountain abbey or the island cloister often serves as the sanctuary for a rare artifact, the training ground for a mystic order, or the last refuge of a forgotten truth. Its impenetrable walls guard secrets as diligently as they once guarded relics. This trope works because we intuitively understand the language of the fortified sanctuary, its promise of isolation and preservation. On a more local, intimate level, the ruins of these abbeys are often woven into regional ghost stories. Tales persist of spectral monks walking the broken walls at twilight, not as malevolent spirits but as eternal guardians. These stories feel authentic because they speak to the profound commitment of those who lived there, a dedication so strong it seems to have imprinted itself on the location. The ghost is not merely a scare, it is a memory, a folkloric echo of the community's unwavering vigil. This enduring fascination, from high literature to campfire tales, points to something deeper in our collective consciousness. We are captivated by the juxtaposition these places embody, the stark contrast between the pursuit of spiritual peace and the grim reality of armed conflict. They represent a fundamental human drama, the struggle to preserve something sacred in a profane and violent world. The stories we tell about them, whether meticulously researched or wildly embellished, are attempts to process that enduring paradox. They allow us to explore questions of faith, sacrifice, and resilience in a setting that makes those abstractions vividly concrete. In this way, the legacy of the fortified monastery transcends its original military and religious functions. It has become a timeless archetype, a ready-made symbol for any narrative about guarded knowledge, spiritual endurance, or the high cost of preserving light against the darkness. The physical walls may crumble, but the stories built upon their foundations ensure these sanctuaries continue to stand tall in the architecture of our imagination, their gates forever inviting us to wonder what truths, what treasures, what echoes of devotion might still lie within. The paradox of the fortified monastery is not locked in the past. Its core tension, the need to protect a fragile peace in a hostile world, echoes in forms the medieval monks could never have imagined. In modern conflict zones, places of worship still find themselves on the front lines of community safety. While the scale and technology are different, the fundamental challenge remains. A church, a mosque, or a synagogue in an area of unrest may not build stone battlements, but it will often invest in discreet security, controlled access, and community watch programs. These are not acts of aggression, but of preservation, measures taken to ensure that the space for prayer, solace, and community can remain open and safe for all who seek it. This is the enduring spirit of the sanctuary, adapting its defenses to the threats of a new era. On a broader civic scale, the concept of the sanctuary city directly channels the medieval ideal. It is a declaration by a modern community that certain spaces or entire jurisdictions will offer protection to vulnerable individuals, shielding them from external legal pressures deemed unjust. Like the abbey that once offered safety to the peasant fleeing a marauding warband, these policies create a zone of calculated safety, using legal and social walls instead of stone to defend a core principle of shelter. More abstractly, each of us engages in a form of personal fortification every day. We build digital walls with passwords and privacy settings to protect our personal information. We cultivate ideological ramparts, surrounding ourselves with communities, news sources, and social circles that reinforce our core beliefs and values against a noisy, often conflicting world. We create routines and personal sanctuaries, a quiet room, a daily walk, a practiced meditation that guard our mental well-being from the constant siege of modern stress. These are our cloisters, our inner monasteries. They may not have physical form, but they serve the same ancient purpose, to create a bounded space where something important to us can exist, persist, and flourish. In this light, the crumbling stone abbeys and sky-high retreats of the medieval world become more than historical curiosities. They transform into powerful metaphors for human resilience. They remind us that the impulse to safeguard what we hold sacred, whether it is faith, family, freedom, or simply a sense of inner peace, is a timeless drive. The methods change from portcullises to firewalls, from relic display to social advocacy, but the underlying architecture of the heart remains familiar. We are all, in our own ways, architects of sanctuary, building whatever walls are necessary to protect the quiet garden within from the chaos that forever knocks at the gate. The modern effort to preserve these sites is itself a form of tribute, a quiet acknowledgement of their layered legacy. Organizations like UNESCO designate locations such as Mont-Saint-Michel and the monasteries of Meteora as World Heritage Sites, a title that does more than protect old stones from decay. It recognizes that these are not simply beautiful buildings or important religious monuments. They are unique historical artifacts, physical testimonies to a complex, often contradictory past. When teams of experts carefully stabilize an ancient wall or restore a faded fresco, they are preserving a dialogue etched in stone, a conversation between the sacred ideal and the earthly struggle to uphold it. This work ensures that the full story endures. We are not just saving architecture, we are safeguarding a question made tangible, a centuries-old experiment in how a community holds its ground, both spiritually and physically. To walk through the restored gatehouse of a place like St. Michel is to experience that duality firsthand. You feel the solemn quiet of the Abbey Church, a space designed for transcendence. Then you step out onto the ramparts and feel the strategic command of the landscape, the sheer drop to the tidal flats below. The preservation allows you to hold both truths in your mind at once, to appreciate the devotion that built the altar and the determination that manned the watchtower. This is why our care for these places matters so deeply. When we support their maintenance, when we visit with mindful respect, we are honoring more than history. We are paying tribute to the full spectrum of human endeavor that played out within those walls. We honor the choir monk who copied manuscripts by candlelight, and we honor the lay brother who stood guard in the rain. We acknowledge the spiritual aspiration that sought heaven and the practical resilience that secured its foothold on earth. This dual heritage is their true gift to us. By ensuring these sites remain for future generations, we pass along not a frozen relic, but a living provocation. We offer a place where anyone can stand and ponder the enduring human tension between seeking peace and preparing for its defense, a silent lesson in stone that continues to speak across the ages. Ultimately, the stone walls were easier to justify than the spiritual compromise they represented. This long history of fortified faith left a deep and complicated mark on Christian theology itself, prompting a quiet but persistent reckoning that scholars still wrestle with today. At its heart lies a profound question: did centuries of necessary defense fundamentally reshape the Church's relationship with violence, moving it away from its earliest pacifist ideals? The earliest Christian communities living under Roman persecution largely rejected military service. Their texts emphasized turning the other cheek and loving one's enemies, framing peace as a core, non-negotiable virtue. The fortified monastery, however, existed in a different world, one where the faith was not a persecuted minority, but a pillar of the social order responsible for protecting people, land, and tradition. This shift from the margins to the center demanded new interpretations. Theologians and abbots began to lean more heavily on the concept of a just war, principles developed by thinkers like St. Augustine. These ideas allowed for the use of force under strict conditions, primarily for the defense of the innocent and the protection of a divinely ordained peace. On the grand scale, this could justify a crusade. On the local scale of a monastic precinct, it justified the gatehouse guard and the lay brother on the wall. Violence was recategorized not as a sin of aggression, but as a sorrowful duty of protection, a last resort to shield the sacred from profane destruction. This theological adaptation was immensely practical, but it also created a new normal. Over generations, the sight of a monk coordinating a defense or a religious house functioning as a military depot became an accepted part of the landscape, not a shocking contradiction. The institutional church became comfortable with managing violence, sanctioning it, and benefiting from the security it provided. Some historians argue this was a prudent and inevitable evolution, a faith growing up and taking responsible stewardship of a broken world. How could it shepherd its flock if it refused to guard the pen? Others see a more troubling deviation, a slow erosion of the radical, countercultural call to peace that defined its origins. They point to moments where defensive necessity blurred into aggressive power, where the wealth and soldiers of a great abbey were used to intimidate neighbors or settle land disputes, actions hard to square with foundational teachings. This debate is not about labeling the past as right or wrong, but about understanding a core tension that every enduring institution faces. It is the eternal struggle between ideal principles and practical survival. The monastic communities lived this tension in its rawest form. Their highest calling was a prayerful peace, yet their continued existence in a violent era required them to master the arts of war. Every stone laid for a new battlement was, in a sense, a theological statement, a declaration that preserving the vessel of faith sometimes meant soiling one's hands with the work of the world. This reckoning invites us to look beyond the medieval cloister. We see similar dilemmas in modern institutions, whether a nation balancing civil liberties with security, or an organization upholding its values under political pressure. The story of the Fortified Monastery presents this ancient choice without easy answers, a permanent question etched not just in parchment, but in the very mortar between the stones. It asks us what we are willing to compromise to protect what we hold sacred, and where that compromise might eventually lead the soul of the institution itself. The story of the monastic fortress is not confined to the valleys of Europe or the theology of a single faith. To see the universal pattern at work, look to the high plateaus of Tibet, where Buddhist monasteries cling to mountainsides like eagles' nests, or to the forested peaks of feudal Japan, where temple complexes were encircled by the walls and warriors of warrior monks. These distant communities, shaped by entirely different spiritual traditions, arrived at a strikingly similar solution to the same fundamental problem. In times of regional conflict or political fracture, where could a tradition's sacred texts, its artistic treasures, and its most devoted practitioners be kept safe? The answer across continents was often elevation and enclosure. The Tibetan Gampa, built on remote, defensible ridges, served as a sanctuary for meditation and a fortress for priceless Thangka paintings and scriptures, its isolation a form of spiritual and physical security during periods of unrest. In Japan, the great temple monasteries like Enryaku-ji on Mount Hiei or the complexes of Garrison evolved into powerful, semi-independent institutions. They maintained their own armies of Sohei or warrior monks to protect their vast landholdings and political interests from rival temples or encroaching samurai lords. Here, the blend of ascetic discipline and martial readiness mirrored, in a different key, the European fusion of cloister and castle. This global glance reveals something profound. The fortified religious community is not an anomaly of medieval Christendom, but a recurring archetype in human history. It emerges wherever three elements converge: concentrated faith, accumulated material or artistic wealth, and a surrounding environment of instability. When these conditions are present, the imperative to protect the spiritual core from the chaos outside seems to trigger a familiar adaptive response. Communities begin to build vertically, seeking the defensive advantage of height. They invest in perimeter walls not just to mark sacred space, but to define a defensible boundary. They develop internal social structures that blend devotional roles with protective duties, whether through lay brother militias, warrior monk orders, or alliances with secular guards. The specific architectural language differs. The pagoda is not a bell tower, the mandala layout is not a Gothic cloister. Yet the underlying grammar is the same, a syntax of stone and spirit arranged for endurance. This pattern speaks to a shared human instinct. It shows that the desire to preserve a sacred way of life, when faced with tangible threat, can lead diverse cultures down parallel paths of innovation. They each discover that protecting a beacon of learning and piety sometimes requires learning the sober geometry of the rampart. Recognizing this global thread does not diminish the unique story of Europe's abbeys. Instead, it places that story within a much wider tapestry of human resilience. It suggests that the drive to build a sanctuary strong enough to outlast the storms of its era is a chapter in our collective history, written over and over again in the stone of mountains and the discipline of those who sought refuge upon them. His name might have been Brother Bertrand, a second son with no inheritance but a strong arm and a troubled soul. He came to the Abbey of St. Martin not as a scholar, but as a laborer, a lay brother seeking redemption through sweat and simple prayer. His past life, the clatter of his father's manor house and the weight of a training sword, was supposed to be left at the gate. For years, his world was the rhythm of the fields, the heft of an axe splitting wood for the winter fires, and the profound silence of the chapel at Vespers. He found a peace there, a purpose in the turning of the seasons and the harvest. feeling closer to the divine in the honest ache of his muscles than he ever had in the noisy hall of his youth. Then, one autumn afternoon, the watch bell shattered that peace. Its clang was not the measured call to prayer, but a frantic, hammering alarm. From the north tower, a column of smoke was rising from a village a few miles down the valley. Raiders were on the move, and the abbey was next. In that moment, Bertrand's two lives collided. The abbot's command echoed in the courtyard, a call for every able-bodied man to take up a defensive post. The other lay brothers, farmers and craftsmen all, looked to him with wide, uncertain eyes. He was the only one among them who knew the feel of a spear's balance, who understood how to stand in a shield wall. The skills he had vowed to renounce, the very violence he had come to this holy place to escape, were now the only things that could protect it. His prayer book remained on the small shelf in his cell. In his hands he took the helmet and crossbow issued from the abbey's armory. The leather strap of the helmet felt foreign, a grim memory, as he climbed the narrow steps to the wall walk. The view from the rampart was not the serene landscape of his daily labors. It was a tactical map. He noted the tree line where archers could hide, the open ground where horsemen would be vulnerable, the weak point in the gatehouse masonry he had once pointed out to the master mason in passing. The monk inside him prayed silently for the safety of all, for the souls of the men approaching with fire in their hearts. The soldier inside him calculated ranges, counted potential arrows, and rehearsed the motions of loading and firing in his mind. When the raiding party finally emerged from the woods, a disorganized band of a few dozen, they hesitated at the sight of the prepared defenses. Arrows were loosed from the walls, not to kill, but to warn, to define a boundary. Bertrand's shot was high, skimming over the leader's head, a message as clear as a shouted command. Stand back. This is not a place you can take. The standoff lasted hours, tension stretched like a bowstring until the raiders, finding no easy plunder, melted back into the forest. No one within the walls was harmed. That evening, the bell rang for compline, the last office of the day. Bertrand stood in the chapel, the scent of incense and cold stone filling the air. His hands, which had held a weapon hours before, were now folded in prayer. The words of the psalm resonated with a new, terrible depth. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. He had been both the protected and the protector. The peace he guarded was now a peace he had actively fought for, and that knowledge settled in him like a heavy, solemn weight. He had not found God only in the stillness of the choir, but also in the focused calm of the watch, in the fierce determination to shield the brothers beside him. His devotion was no longer a simple thing. It was a complex tapestry woven with threads of contemplation and action, of pacifist yearning and protective duty. Through the eyes of one man like Bertrand, the grand architecture of history becomes human scale. We feel the internal chill of the alarm bell, the rough grip of the spear, the profound relief at the retreat, and the complicated gratitude in the quiet of the chapel afterward. His story is the essence of the era's tension, lived not in theory, but in the heartbeat of a single man standing where the cloister met the castle wall, forever bridging the distance between the peace he sought and the strength required to keep it. A monastery's influence did not stop at its outer wall. Its authority flowed outward, shaping the very land around it into a carefully managed domain of safety and productivity. This was the landscape of power where the fortified presence of a religious community did more than defend a sacred space. It actively organized the secular world for miles in every direction. The most visible sign of this power was the town that often grew like a protective skirt around the abbey's walls. Pilgrims needed inns and stables. Craftsmen arrived to supply the community's needs, from blacksmiths to bookbinders. Merchants set up stalls to trade with the steady stream of visitors and the monastery's own large household. What began as a simple gatehouse for travelers could, over generations, evolve into a bustling borough with its own charter and market square, all existing under the abbot's legal protection and authority. The monastery's walls guaranteed the safety that made this settlement possible, turning the shadow of its fortifications into a zone of economic opportunity and civic growth. The abbey's control extended along the natural veins of the landscape, the rivers and roads. A monastery built at a key ford or bridge didn't just guard it, they often owned it, charging a modest toll for safe passage and maintenance. This control of movement was a form of soft power, regulating trade and travel across the region. Their management reached into the forests and fields as well. The vast landholdings granted by pious nobles were not left wild, they were systematically developed. Lay brothers and tenant farmers cleared woodland for new fields, built and maintained fish ponds, and managed sheep pastures whose wool became a major source of wealth. The monastery functioned as the region's most advanced agricultural corporation, experimenting with crop rotation, animal husbandry, and storage techniques that maximized yield. This made them the economic engine for the entire area, providing steady employment, setting prices at market, and storing surplus grain to alleviate famine in lean years. Their military capacity, therefore, was never a standalone function. It was one integrated tool within a much broader package of lordship. The ability to field a garrison or close a gate was part of how they enforced the peace necessary for their economic projects to thrive. It protected the roads so merchants could travel, it secured the harvest from opportunistic bandits, and it ensured that the abbot's legal judgments and administrative decrees were respected. They were not isolated castles preoccupied only with their own defense. They were central organs in the body politic, vital to the region's legal, economic, and social health. A dispute between two farmers might be settled in the abbot's court. A new mill built with monastic funds would grind grain for all the local villages. The charity distributed at the Gatehouse fed the poor and ailing. Every aspect of daily life was touched by the abbey's multifaceted authority. The fortified wall, then, was the hard shell around this soft, pervasive influence. It was the ultimate guarantor of a system that provided order, sustenance, and spiritual meaning to thousands. The monastery's true strength lay not in defying the world outside its walls, but in so thoroughly shaping the world that lay just beyond them. Stone walls can hide as much as they reveal. For every grand archway and recorded charter from the age of the fortified monastery, there are whispers in the dark, gaps in the parchment that historians and archaeologists are still trying to fill. These unanswered questions are not failures of the record, but invitations, reminding us that our understanding of these communities is a story still being written. Consider the ground beneath your feet at any great ruin. We can map the foundations of the church, the cloister, the gatehouse, but what lies beneath those stones? Persistent legends at sites across Europe speak of extensive tunnel networks, secret passages leading from the abbey crypt to a nearby forest or a hidden cove on a riverbank. Were these merely tales to thrill later generations, or do they hold a kernel of truth? In an era of sudden raids, a concealed escape route for the abbot and the most precious relics would have been a logical, if highly secret, precaution. Modern ground-penetrating radar has sometimes found anomalies, voids that hint at structures deeper than the known foundations. Yet without physical excavation, which is often too risky for the stability of the ruins above, they remain tantalizing mysteries. What or who might those tunnels have saved in a final, desperate hour? Then there are the lost libraries. We know monks read and copied military manuals like Vegetius, but what other practical knowledge did they possess? An abbey's scriptorium might have held a unique compilation, a handwritten guide blending local herbal remedies for battlefield injuries with diagrams for reinforcing a wooden gate. Such a book, used until it fell apart, would rarely survive. Its knowledge, passed orally from master mason to lay brother, would vanish when the community itself dispersed. We are left to piece together their tactical thinking from indirect clues, like the strategic placement of a well or the curious angle of a defensive wall that seems to anticipate a specific type of assault. The most elusive mysteries, however, involve the shadow world of diplomacy and intelligence. An abbot was a feudal lord, a spiritual leader, and a businessman. To protect his house, he needed information. Did he maintain networks of informants in nearby towns or rival courts? Did he send trusted lay brothers, disguised as merchants or pilgrims, to gauge the intentions of a restless neighboring duke? Correspondence between abbots and kings often survives, but the informal, secretive exchanges, the quiet alliances and understood threats have left no trace. We see the result, a monastery that somehow anticipated an attack or secured a last-minute royal intervention, but we cannot see the hidden wires that were pulled to make it happen. This incomplete picture is what makes history breathe. It acknowledges that the full reality of these communities was lived in the spaces between the official records, in the decisions made in candlelit chambers, and in the knowledge that was never written down. Every time an archaeologist's trowel uncovers an unexpected artifact, a strange foundation, or a hidden cache, it has the potential to rewrite a paragraph of this story. Each newly translated fragment of a chronicle might mention a forgotten siege or a tactical innovation. These unanswered questions ensure that the fortified monastery is not a fossil, but a conversation. They pull us into the narrative, asking us to look closer, to wonder more deeply about the silent strategies and the hidden safeguards that allowed faith to endure in a fortress world. That synthesis reveals a profound truth about these stone and spirit sanctuaries. They were not accidents of history, but a deliberate, brilliant response to a world where security was a rare and precious commodity. Born at the precise intersection of deep faith, very real fear, and the binding chains of feudal obligation, they stand as a unique phenomenon, a testament to human adaptation under immense pressure. We cannot fully understand them if we try to force them into our modern categories. They defy the simple divisions we often prefer, between the purely religious and the overtly martial, or between a life dedicated to peace and one prepared for war. The very essence of the fortified monastery was its refusal to choose one over the other. It held both realities in a constant, dynamic, and often uncomfortable balance. In this way, these walled communities became perfect microcosms of the entire medieval world. Within their enclosed precincts, you could find every major contradiction of the era playing out on a human scale. Here was profound devotion in the quiet monk copying a gospel by candlelight. Here, too, was the ever-present shadow of violence in the lay brother sharpening his spear point against the cloister wall. Here was staggering ingenuity in the hydraulic systems that brought water from distant springs and the agricultural science that filled the siege granaries. And overarching it all was that relentless, driving struggle, the struggle to carve out a pocket of order, meaning, and continuity from a landscape that often seemed ruled by chaos. The monastery's rulebook was not just for spiritual conduct, it was a blueprint for societal survival. They teach us that resilience is rarely a single act but a layered strategy. It was spiritual resilience maintained through the unwavering rhythm of prayer. It was social resilience built on a clear hierarchy and shared purpose that could mobilize an entire community in an instant. It was economic resilience powered by managed lands and strategic trade that funded the walls. And it was undeniably military resilience expressed in architecture and readiness. Each layer supported the others, creating an institution that was far more than the sum of its parts. This holistic approach to preservation is perhaps their most enduring lesson. When faced with existential threat, they did not retreat into only one aspect of their identity. Instead, they called upon every resource they had, spiritual, economic, social, and physical, weaving them together into a fabric strong enough to withstand the pressures of their age. So as we look back on their silent ruins or walk their still imposing ramparts, we are not just looking at old buildings. We are witnessing the physical form of a complex historical bargain, a centuries-long negotiation between the ideal of heavenly peace and the reality of earthly conflict. They challenge us to move beyond simple labels and to appreciate the nuanced, often difficult choices communities make to endure. In their stones, we see the shape of a world where the sanctuary was not a passive refuge, but an active, determined, and fiercely guarded creation. From the tidal fortress of Mont-Saint-Michel to the sky-high sanctuaries of Meteora, these stories reveal a medieval world far more complex and interconnected than we often imagine. It was a world where the lines we draw today between the sacred and the secular, between a life of peace and a posture of defense, were not so clearly defined. In the face of relentless uncertainty, these communities made a profound choice to adapt, to build, and to endure. They became unlikely bastions not out of a desire for conflict, but from a fierce determination to preserve the very possibility of peace, learning, and prayer for generations to come. This long history teaches us about the resilience of the human spirit when faced with impossible choices. It shows us adaptation in its most tangible form, written in stone and lived in the daily rhythms of a community that had to master both the psalter and the spear. It reveals how boundaries can blur not from carelessness but from necessity, creating something entirely new in the process, a spiritual fortress. Above all, it speaks to an enduring instinct, a drive to protect what we hold sacred, whether that is faith, knowledge, community, or simply a way of life. The next time you see an image of an ancient abbey or stand before its quiet ruins, look closer. See not just a peaceful relic of a bygone age, but the echo of a fortified world. See the strategic placement on the landscape, the thickness of the remaining walls, the height of the tower. Imagine the sound of the bell that called both to prayer and to arms. In those stones, you are witnessing the physical memory of a grand and difficult compromise, a testament to the timeless struggle to guard a light against the surrounding darkness. If this journey into the layered past of these warrior monks and guardian abbots intrigued you, there are countless more hidden chapters of history waiting to be explored. Subscribe to continue these deep dives into the stories that shaped our world, and we would love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most about this fusion of faith and fortification? Share your reflections in the comments below.